shall not fear. What can mere men do to me? All day long they twist my words and say hurtful things. All their evil thoughts are against me, or all their thoughts are against me for evil. They attack, they hide and lurk. They watch my steps as they have expectantly waited to take my life. Cast them out because of their wickedness. In anger, bring down the peoples, O God. You have taken account of my wanderings, put my tears in your bottle. Are they not recorded in thy book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that for God is for me. In God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise. In God have I put my trust and confident reliance. I will not be afraid. Your vows are binding upon me, O God. I will give thank offerings to you, for you have rescued my soul from death. Yes, and my feet from stumbling, so that I might walk before God in the light of life. Aren't you so thankful for all that God has done for us? And aren't you so thankful for how God continues to move in our lives? There's often times that we get down and we have struggles and trials and tribulations, but we need to remember that David went through the same thing. And there are countless other examples of people that went through the same thing. This morning, with the help of the Lord, I'm going to just speak on kindness. We're going to talk about a couple different things, and we're just going to go through this. I'm not going to be very long, probably going to be about 25 minutes. So if you're keeping track, it's 10:08 right now. So about 10:33, that's some good mental math. You should be ready for me to be bringing it to a landing. I'll be calling traffic control to bring it to a close. Just before Christmas in 1982 in Melbourne, Australia, the Yujovic family was ready to welcome their son into the world. Long before 40 sonograms, the family saw their baby through 3 sonograms, and they did not reveal any complications. But as soon as the baby was born, they were all stunned. He was born with a rare syndrome called tetra-amelia syndrome, a disorder marked by the absence of arms and legs. According to Nick Vujicic's autobiography, his mother refused to see him or hold him shortly after his birth. She and her husband left the hospital to process what life was about to look like for the rest of Nick's future and theirs as they committed to caring for him. As Nick grew and enrolled in elementary school, his classmates bullied him. At one point, he tried to drown himself, but someone jumped in and saved his life. He wondered why he struggled while other children did not. He even questioned if his life had any purpose. His parents recognized his depression and loneliness, and they helped him see the positives in life. Somewhere in his adolescent years, Nick looked to God and started a relationship with him. To this day, he points to his faith in God as the strength that helps him day by day. At 19 years old, Nick gave his first inspirational talk and realized his life could inspire others to overcome whatever challenges they were facing. Although he does not have fully formed legs, he was born with one foot just a few inches below his left hip. The toes on his foot were fused, and he underwent an operation to separate those toes so he could use them as fingers. He refers to them as chicken drumsticks. He can type up to 43 words per minute. That's impressive. Just above the average of a non-professional typist. Since his first inspirational talk, he has shared his story to millions of people, sometimes to stadiums full of people, sometimes to church youth groups. When he turned 32, he founded Nick V Ministries, formerly Life Without Limbs, where he still serves as president and CEO. 7 years later, in February 2012, he married Kanane Mariar, and he and his wife have 2 daughters. Nick is an author, speaker, musician, and his hobbies include fishing, painting, and swimming, all without arms and legs. His story continues to amaze those who hear it and is a living example of someone who overcame major physical challenges to make an impact. There is a prime example of a person who could have given up on life. Obviously, At the beginning of that story, he did try to give up on life. But God had a purpose for his life. Even through all of his physical limitations, even through all the impairments, the things that would detract him from having a relationship with God, he still found a way to find God. He still found a way to find peace. And it doesn't necessarily say that he belongs, what kind of denomination or church that he belongs to, but he has faith and trust in God. And some of us who have fully formed arms and legs, sometimes we have trouble seeing the positives in our life. And trust me, there is a lot of things to complain about. There's a lot of things to be upset about. But it's understanding that we're not worthy of God's grace, but he still gave it to us. He still teaches us how to live with grace. There's a lot of times that we can operate under the understanding and under the auspice of, oh man, I have it so bad. There's a couple times in the last, couple of years that there's been times where I've just really gotten down on myself, and I'd be like, man, this is the worst. Who has it worse than me? And there's always somebody that you can point to who might have it worse than you. And most of the time, they're having a better time living their life than you in your moment of despair. And it's because they have this understanding. My circumstances aren't going to change, so my attitude can. Most times, that's all it really takes is us understanding our attitude about the situation has to change. Our circumstances might never change. We hear about the story of Paul and all the things that he went through, and he was still writing the Bible. He was still penning his story. He was still penning his relationship with God. If there's anybody who could be upset that even God called him and he still has to go through shipwreck, he still has to go through stoning, he still has to go through all of these things, but he could still find a way to praise God. And obviously, as Christians in this last day, there has been some persecution to the church. Nothing in any way, shape, or form in close proximity to what the disciples and the early church faced. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've never been spit on. I've never had people throw rocks at me. I've never had people try to chase me for serving the Lord. There is always going to be something that has an opportunity to be worse. Before the time of the kings of Israel, God wanted to be their king. However, Israel rejected God so that they might have a king like the surrounding nations. Isn't it so interesting that we have this great message, but there are some churches who try to water it down? There are some people who they want to be close to what the world is, or they want to be close so that they can have closer connection. And sure, it would be easy for us to fill the church. All we would have to do is stop preaching about what the Bible talks about, stop talking about being baptized in Jesus' name, experience the infilling of the Holy Ghost, remove all sort of separation from ourselves and the world. And I'm sure we could go and we could get large crowds and we could have people who are, invested and want to get involved. But we know that God is calling us for a higher purpose. We are supposed to be separate from this world. There is supposed to be distinction about us, not just in appearance, but in our hearts. Our hearts need to be different than what the world is experiencing and different than what the world has to offer. There are often times that I talk to my coworkers, and I'm not talking to them really because most of them are, hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from me. I'm chatting with them through the keyboard, and I'm just asking them how their day went. And man, there's a lot of people who go through a lot of horrible things, and I can't even begin to think about what they do and how they make it through. One of the things that I try to share with them is that God is still with them, and I'm praying for them and just giving them opportunity to understand that there is someone even thousands of miles or hundreds of miles away that's still believing for them in their situation. But the thing that's amazing is God accommodated the request of the Israelites. They rejected him as being their ultimate king and their ultimate authority because they wanted to be like everybody else. They wanted to have a king who sat on a throne and who dictated to the people. And there obviously is lots of things that kings, and sometimes if we can make the direct parallel to our situation currently, presidents that can do good things for us, but then there are times that people can do bad things against us. And not to get down a political rabbit hole, but can you imagine if we as a nation just allowed God to move the way that he needed to, and we just put our faith and trust in him, and there was a prophet that would just come, and or a judge that would just come, and they would say, listen, this is what the Lord is speaking. This is what the Lord is saying for his people. I don't even know how you would go against that. I don't know why you would want to go against that. We have times in church where pastor is speaking things that he doesn't necessarily know about us, but God enlightens him to certain things that we're going through. So we have that experience, but fully depending on God for everything. The children of Israel, they were in a interesting situation where they didn't really have want for anything. Jamie in the Bread Bible Chart group the other day was talking about, eating manna for 40 years. Hey, I'm sure that it tasted like manna. And then on the second day, it probably tasted like manna. And on the third day, it probably tasted like manna. But by day, I'm not even going to try to do the math on 40 years of manna. Maybe they were pretending it was something else. Maybe they pretended it was, camel steaks or, whatever delicacy they had of that day, quail. I don't know. What'd you say? Duck. Yes. Yeah. Definitely. They probably used good seasonings back in the Bible days. Definitely. They probably had like MSG and lots of salt. Yeah, it was probably, yeah, definitely. But anyway, it was easy for them to get complaining because God was feeding them every day. Manna. Unbelievable. And he was giving it to them. Like they didn't even have to, man, listen, they had to pick it up. Yes, they did. But it's not like they had to go far. Like if we want something today, if we don't want to cook, we have to go to a restaurant and we have to hope that those people are in a good mood. When we get there, we have to hope that they are preparing fresh food for us and it hasn't been sitting in a broiler for 4 hours. And then we have to open our bag and hope that they got our order right. Oh man, my Wendy's experience is coming back to me. There's so many times I was talking to Brady the other week, and Oliver loves to bring up old things that happened to him, and he said, "Daddy, do you remember that time that we went through the drive-thru at Burger King and they messed our whole order up?" It was when we were passing out tracts for Berwick. We went through the Berwick Burger King drive-thru. I ordered a kid's cheeseburger. I got a cheeseburger with bacon, tomato, and lettuce. And there were no fries. And the other half of our order with fries were cold. And they messed up everything. So we saunter back, we drive back. And I'm like, hey, I was just here. You made my sandwich wrong. And my child won't eat it. Like, oh, okay, no problem. What was it? I was like, a kid's cheeseburger, only ketchup. So I go up to the window, and they hand it out to me as soon as I get to the second window, and I was like, this is not going to be good. And it was wrong again. So needless to say, Oliver didn't eat that night, but he reminds me, hey, Daddy, do you remember when they did that? And I said to Brady, I said, hey, I can sympathize with those people because when I was working at Wendy's, There was a person that came through one time. They wanted a single cheese sandwich, but they wanted only cheese. I don't know what was going on with me that day. I don't know if I was feeling particularly funny, but I got the bun. I just threw a piece of cheese on it. I wrapped it up, and I sent it out. And that person comes back through, and they're like, hey, I was just through your drive-through, and I ordered a single cheese with just cheese. And obviously, we all have headsets so we can hear everything. I said to my manager, I was like, I just made that the way the guy wanted it. And then the guy says, there's no meat on it. So, apparently, they did not want an untoasted cheese sandwich. They wanted a cheeseburger with just cheese on it. And I got that. Then I had people who, I had a employee one time that tried to do the same thing that I did. And I was like, no, they want the meat. They just want only cheese. They're like, are you sure? I was like, I'm pretty sure this has happened to me before. Like, I questioned the first time, but this second time, I think I know what's up. But anyway, getting back to our lesson. God accommodated their request despite being rejected, and Samuel anointed Saul as king. While externally Saul seemed to be an ideal candidate for king, internally Saul had different plans. Instead of executing the will of God, Saul chose to execute his own will. God ultimately rejected Saul because Saul believed his ways were better than God's, leading us to young David. David was the youngest of Jesse's several sons, and he shepherded some of his father's sheep. Samuel, Israel's last judge, was called to anoint a new king over Israel since God had rejected Saul as king. Samuel arrived at Jesse's house. Jesse must have been surprised to see the judge and prophet Samuel visit his home unannounced. That would kind of be scary if pastor just like showed up at your house at like 2:30 in the morning. Time's up. God's got something to speak to you. Anyway, just a little side note. We're going hunting in the morning. No, I'm just kidding. All right, sorry. The prophet asked Jesse to assemble his sons because God had promised to speak to Samuel when Israel's new king stood before him. Jesse called his sons, and they assembled before Samuel. Perhaps Samuel walked before them like a drill sergeant, inspecting new cadets. Likely everyone was nervous. You ever had someone do that to you? Like walk around you and, kind of look you up and down. It's an odd feeling. We had several inspections when I was at Wendy's, and the inspector would always come in, and he would look at your clothes and look at your shirts and make sure everything was clean so you're presentable to the customer. And it was just a really weird feeling. You just felt like you were under a microscope. And anyway, going back, likely everyone was nervous, but Samuel may have been the most nervous. If Saul found out Samuel was seeking out a new king while Saul still sat on the throne, might be the end for Samuel. It's kind of what happens. After examining all of Jesse's sons standing before him, God spoke to Samuel that none of these were the right candidate. Confused, Samuel asked Jesse if he had any more sons. Jesse looked at the ground for a moment and then answered that he had one more, David, who was tending to the sheep. We cannot know with certainty why Jesse did not call David, but we can deduce Jesse believed David was not even a candidate for king. Suddenly, David heard voices calling for him in the distance and took off running toward home. When he arrived, he saw the puzzled expression of the faces of his father and his brothers. And then David's face turned toward Samuel. Samuel's eyes opened wide with surprise if he had found someone he had been searching for. Samuel approached David and poured anointing oil upon his head. David would be Israel's next king. As quickly as Samuel came, Samuel left. leaving Jesse and all his sons awestruck with surprise. Perhaps they did not know until then, know it then, but they had just experienced God's grace. Because David's lineage is what carries through to the Messiah. It's amazing to me. But why do you think that Jesse excluded David when Samuel told him to assemble his sons? Could it have been, like this lesson is asking, that he didn't even think he was a candidate? Or could it have been that, he just didn't even think about David? David was off tending the sheep, and he was lowly, and he wasn't as big as his other brothers. Maybe that was the reason. Maybe he just thought that there wasn't anything that he needed to be worried about for David. The word grace may be described how a ballet dancer moves graciously. It may also be utilized to express gratitude following a gracious donation. However, the Bible uses the word grace to refer to the way God continues to view and respond to humanity favorably. Aren't you so glad for God's grace? It's for his grace that we're standing here today. Or you're sitting, I'm standing. But it's because of grace that we're all here today. There are times, even in our walk with God, that he has to extend grace and mercy to us. Even if we've lived in this life for 30 or 40 years, there's still opportunity for God to extend his grace to us. I'm thankful for that. When we understand that we have all sinned and fallen short of God's glory, we realize none of us deserves God's grace. We don't deserve God's grace, but he gives it to us freely. He graciously went to the cross for us. It is unmerited favor. When Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden tree and realized they were naked, God responded with mercy and undeserved favor by fashioning their clothes. I know I've said this before, but when I was a young man, probably the age of 5 or 6, I would say to my classmates in kindergarten, man, if Eve wouldn't have eaten of the fruit, none of us would be here right now. We'd be in the garden. We'd be living it up. We wouldn't have to be learning our ABCs. We'd already know them. We wouldn't have to be listening to this teacher talk to us about how to add 1 plus 1, which is 2, by the way. I see I've learned. But we would have been sitting in the garden in a lap of luxury. But it was years later that I realized that that's not true. That God's plan from the very beginning was to have a relationship with his creation. When separation was created or introduced, God had already had a plan of how he was going to save his creation. It wasn't an accident. God knew that these things were going to happen. So even if Eve wouldn't have eaten from the fruit or from the tree, it would have been another woman that would have eaten of the tree. See what I did there? Okay. Some of you, it took you a minute. Anyway. I only have 3 minutes, so I gotta hustle. The idea that human beings have somehow gotten a raw deal from God is unfortunately quite common. How many people have ever thought, God, why me? Why do you have to keep doing this to me? Why did you have to give me all of these good looks? That's what my brother asks himself every morning. Why have you made my mother favor me highly? That's actually what Jamie says in the morning. No, I'm just kidding. But God uses grace for transformation through his favor, so we may become the people he calls us to be. He gives so graciously, our cup runs over. Likewise, God also gives grace to us so we may lead others along the process of transformation, healing, and reconciliation. Sometimes it doesn't seem like our cup runneth over. But I'm going to tell you, you're still alive. You're still breathing. God has got you. It might not look like it, but your cup is running over. God's tremendous grace kept David and carried him from a shepherd's field to the battlefield, and from exile in the wilderness to the throne in the palace. Indeed, David knew by faith and experience that God was with him always, even when he walked through the valley of the shadow of death, as Psalms 23:4 points out. Once David was in the palace, he felt compelled to spread God's grace to others, specifically to those in Saul's household. Jonathan, Saul's son, was David's greatest friend and ally. Jonathan could have treated David as an enemy. David's existence and anointing stood in the way of Jonathan's succession to the throne following Saul's death. Likewise, David should have viewed Jonathan as competition for the throne. Nevertheless, Jonathan did not once oppose the will of God like his father Saul had repeatedly done. David wept when he learned of the deaths of Saul and his best friend Jonathan. Some were happy for David because he was finally free from Saul's maniacal manhunts. But David mourned his friend and his friend's father. Several years later, King David wanted to honor them both by being gracious to what remained to their family. In other kingdoms, a new ruler was expected to fell the previous ruler's family tree to prevent pretentious usurpers who might challenge the new ruler. David had no such plan. What those fancy words are saying there is when a new king would take over, it was completely expected that the new king would kill all of the old king's relatives. So there weren't anyone that could say, no, I'm the true heir to the king. That's what would happen. But there was a boy, his name was Mephibosheth, was Jonathan's son and Saul's grandson. When news came that the Philistines had defeated Israel on Mount Gilboa, Mephibosheth's nurse feared for their safety and fled the palace. While making their hasty escape, the nurse somehow dropped him, and the injuries he sustained left him lame in both feet. At only 5 years old, he could no longer walk. He and his nurse and his family went into exile in the north. Initially, they feared being killed as the Philistines continued their conquest of Israel. However, when Mephibosheth and his family learned of David's coronation, perhaps they feared that David would put them to death to secure his claim to the throne. This assumption may explain why they stayed in exile and did not return to Jerusalem. Mephibosheth's disability also changed how Israelite society viewed him. Israelites considered disability to be a result of sin. The prevailing theories were that the parents, another family member, or the person experienced the disability sinned. When a person was born with a disability, religious experts even advocated that the person had somehow sinned in the womb before birth. It's amazing to me to try to wrap your head around that, or wrap your mind even around that. But some years later, David sought out Saul's family because he wanted to show them the kindness of God. David learned that Mephibosheth, he learned of him being still alive and invited him to the palace, where he restored Saul's land to him and invited him to live with him in the royal palace. Mephibosheth would dine with the king every night. We shake our head and smile at David's grace. Not only did he give Mephibosheth access to a life of luxury and comfort, but David lifted him out of the margins of society and replanted him in a position of prominence. He was saying, even though this man has a disability, he still is favored by God. He still has God's grace. He was saying that it wasn't the fact, it wasn't the case that Mephibosheth had sinned and that's what caused his disability. He was trying to extend grace where God, or where the people would know that it was from God. Some might have seen Mephibosheth as the enemy or a threat to David's rule. Others would have seen him as a sinner due to his disability. However, David saw someone to whom he could show God's abundant grace. Tower, this is Captain Jeremy coming in for a landing requesting clearance. Clearance granted. 1 Peter 4:10 reads, "As every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God." God has called us to be good stewards or managers of the grace he has given us. We must use the gifts he has given us to minister to others. We must use the grace that God has given us to give to others. There's so many parables. There's a parable of talents. There's a parable of the servant that owed his master money. And there's so many different things that the Bible talks about where grace is extended. However, it is time for us to start living the Bible out in our daily lives and explaining to people that God's grace is still available for you. It's not just me. It's not just the people in this church, but God's grace is available to everyone. And I'm so thankful for that. Maybe that's why I was so thankful this morning, is going over these notes and just truly understanding the gravity of what God's grace has meant for me in my life. When sin abounds, his grace doth much more abound. And I am so thankful to know that God still loves me and is still gracious for me. I want a couple extra minutes. I hope you don't mind. I took 6 extra minutes. It's 10:40 now. If you want to go and get some refreshments, I think there's some water in the fountain. Or if you want to see, there's coffee. Oh, there's coffee out there. Hey, listen, I don't ever make assumptions, because bad things happen when you do that. I'm not going to be the one. I received a frantic phone call last night. Hold on, I'm going to stop my timer. I'm going to read what time I got the call. Hold on, friends. Oh, well, it was earlier than I thought it was. It was 6:43. I received a frantic phone call from Francis Passmore. And he said, "Aren't we only supposed to have one service tomorrow?" And I said, "No." He said, "Are you sure?" I'm pretty sure. I'm teaching Life Steps. You're preaching. That makes 2. He said, "Well, it says on the calendar that there's only one." I was like, "Well, everyone will be there, and they'll be surprised if there's no donuts." Yay. But no, I don't even know why I was trying to tell that. Anyway, grace is good. Devil bad. Coffee out there. You speak words now. God bless you. See you back at 11.